The barbed wire, coiled and menacing, formed a physical barrier that defined their new world. Yet its sharp points were a superficial threat compared to the profound, psychological wound inflicted by the silence that descended each time a new contingent of prisoners shuffled through the gates. These men, soldiers of the Wehrmacht who had once been the sharp tip of the most formidable military force in Europe, now found themselves confined within the boundaries of American-run prisoner-of-war camps. They were steeled for the expected hardships: interrogations, political indoctrination, harsh labor, or even outright punishment. They had prepared themselves for a confrontation of wills and ideologies. What they were entirely unprepared for, however, was the evidence presented not through words, but through stark, grainy images. The first instance was almost casual, an event that began with little fanfare. A small group of GIs gathered near one of the barracks, their demeanor serious but not overtly aggressive. One of the American guards produced a worn, folded envelope from his tunic pocket. He laid it flat on a rough-hewn wooden table, and with a deliberate motion, spread its contents for all to see. They were black and white photographs, their edges softened and smudged from handling. At first glance, they appeared to be the typical documentation of war: scenes of urban rubble, weary infantrymen, and piles of abandoned personal effects. But as the German prisoners shuffled closer, some driven by a morbid curiosity, others pushed forward by their comrades, the horrifying details snapped into focus. These were not images of battlefields. They were visions from a nightmare. They showed endless rows of emaciated corpses, limbs tangled in grotesque piles. They revealed faces so starved that the skin was stretched taut over skulls, the eyes sunken and vacant. There were photographs of children, their bodies fragile, their eyes unnaturally large and filled with a suffering that belied their youth. A low murmur rippled through the crowd of prisoners. A corporal, hailing from Bremen, scoffed loudly, muttering about enemy propaganda and exaggerated atrocities designed to demoralize them. But then a younger soldier, a boy who had seen the horrors of the Eastern Front, leaned in for a closer look. He recoiled violently as if physically struck. The battlefields he had known were scenes of violent military death. This was something entirely different, a systematic, industrial-scale annihilation that defied all his previous conceptions of conflict. The camp's commandant, observing the rising tide of disquiet and whispered conversations, gave a quiet order. The guards were to continue showing the photographs. This was not a spontaneous act of cruelty, it was a deliberate policy. The year was 1945, and in the preceding weeks, American forces had liberated places whose names would soon become synonymous with ultimate evil: Dachau in late April, and Buchenwald earlier that same month. The American leadership understood that a great many German soldiers, particularly those captured in the final chaotic battles on the front lines, possessed either a profound ignorance or a willful denial of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Therefore, the GIs carried the undeniable proof in their pockets: hastily developed prints from Army Signal Corps photographers, or copies distributed among the troops to bear witness. These were not the polished, carefully composed images of propaganda posters. They were raw, unfiltered, and often technically imperfect records of what the liberators had discovered, their very imperfections lending them an irrefutable authenticity. Inside the prisoner-of-war compounds, a tumultuous clash of emotions erupted. Disbelief, that primary defense mechanism of the human psyche, warred with a deeply ingrained national pride. Some officers, their authority diminished but their arrogance intact, barked commands at their men to turn away, insisting with vehemence that the scenes were staged, a grotesque form of American theater. Others, stripped of their rank but not their ideological conditioning, whispered to anyone who would listen that the Americans had employed Hollywood special effects to fabricate the evidence. Yet, the photographs continued to circulate, moving from hand to hand, from one barracks hut to the next. The word spread like a contagion through the camp. They are showing us camps, terrible camps, Jews, political prisoners, civilians, The effect was profound and pervasive, like a heavy stone cast into a still pond. The initial, placid surface of collective denial was broken, and ripples of doubt began to spread outward, slowly eroding the hardened facades of these men's minds. A soldier from Bavaria, his voice barely a whisper, confessed that he had heard unsettling rumors about freight trains passing near his village under the cover of darkness, their destinations unknown. Another admitted, with a hesitant tone, that certain requisition orders for vast quantities of civilian clothing and personal effects had always seemed peculiar, but to voice such suspicions during the war was a ticket to a traitor's fate. The pervasive fear of betrayal, a habit ingrained by the Gestapo state, lingered even within the relative safety of captivity. For the Americans, this initiative was far more than a tactic of psychological warfare. It was a moral imperative, a confrontation of the enemy with a reality so horrific that it could not be rationalized away. Their objective was to ensure that these captives would carry this searing knowledge back to a defeated Germany, to dismantle the architecture of denial before it could harden into a durable, post-war legend. This was the reason why, day after day, American guards would unfold these photographic testaments, laying them out on tables like a dealer revealing a winning hand in a high-stakes game. A game where the stakes were historical truth and moral accountability. The German soldiers had already experienced the profound shock of military defeat, the humiliation of surrender, and the collapse of the Thousand-Year Reich. But this was a different kind of shock altogether, one that struck not at their pride as warriors, but at their core as human beings. It was a shock that gnawed insidiously at the conscience. In those initial days, disbelief remained the armor to which most clung desperately. Yet, with each photograph examined, with each ghastly image seared into their memories, that armor was chipped away, fragment by fragment, until the silence that settled over the barracks at night became heavier and more constricting than any physical chain. By the spring of 1945, names like Dachau and Buchenwald began to spread through the Allied ranks not as mere place names, but as whispered thunderclaps of revelation. These were not simply prisons or detention centers. They were factories of death, places where the very concept of humanity had been systematically broken, stripped away, and incinerated. When the U.S. 7th Army liberated Dachau on April 29th, they stumbled into a realm of nightmare. Approximately 30,000 skeletal survivors, barely clinging to life, and the ghastly spectacle of tens of thousands of corpses piled high in rail cars and dumped into open pits. Buchenwald had been freed weeks earlier, on April 11th, by troops of the 6th Armored Division, and it revealed a similar panorama of horror. The soldiers who first entered these camps, hardened veterans who had witnessed the brutalities of combat, knew with immediate, visceral certainty that what they were seeing transcended the normal boundaries of warfare. They understood that verbal descriptions would be inadequate, even sacrilegious, in capturing the full scope of the atrocity. This is why so many GIs, from Signal Corps photographers to ordinary infantrymen, wielded their cameras. They documented the skeletal men draped in tattered striped uniforms, the mountains of naked, lifeless bodies, the grim, efficient furnaces still filled with human ash, and the haunting, ghost-like faces of children who had been reduced to living skeletons. These were not carefully composed propaganda shots taken from flattering angles with perfect lighting. They were blunt, often handheld and jarringly blurry images, snapped by hands trembling with a mixture of rage, revulsion, and profound sorrow. It was precisely their technical imperfections, their raw and unvarnished quality, that made them so devastatingly real and impossible to dismiss as fabrication. Inside the POW compounds scattered across Europe, American guards began to use these images as tools of undeniable indictment. They would gather small, manageable groups of German prisoners and lay the photographs out before them, like a prosecutor presenting incontrovertible evidence in a court of law. "This is Dachau," a GI would state flatly, his finger pointing to an image of corpses stacked like cordwood. "This is Buchenwald," another would add, tapping a photograph of the camp's gallows. They typically did not lecture or harangue the prisoners at length. They didn't need to. The photographs themselves became the accusers, their silent testimony more powerful than any speech. For a significant number of the German prisoners, this was their first unfiltered encounter with the true, monstrous scale of what the Nazi regime had engineered. Back in Germany, they had been fed a steady diet of lies through state-controlled media. Newsreels showing tidy barracks where asocials and enemies of the state were purportedly being productively re-educated, with smiling prisoners pretending to play in orchestras or tend gardens. Now, staring down at these photographs, that carefully constructed facade collapsed in an instant. Here were bodies twisted in agonized poses that no actor could convincingly reproduce. Here were the eyes of survivors, hollowed out by suffering, staring directly into the lens and, by extension, into the souls of those viewing the images. Of course, not all prisoners were willing to believe. Some, their minds still imprisoned by years of Nazi ideology, insisted that these were clever Soviet forgeries, or that the Americans had simply gathered victims from a famine-stricken region and staged the scenes. To counter this, the American guards often supplemented the visual evidence with specific, verifiable details that only first-hand witnesses could provide. They spoke of the specific dates of liberation: Dachau on April 29th by the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions, Buchenwald on April 11th. They described in graphic detail the unique, sweetly putrid smell of death that hung over the camps, a stench that clung to their uniforms and hair for days. They recounted the heart-rending sight of the liberation itself, the skeletal survivors who stumbled toward them, weeping with a joy they no longer had the strength to express, or the boxcars filled with corpses that had been destined for the crematoria. These sensory details, the dates, the smells, the sounds, were impossible to invent, and they left a deep and lasting impression, corroding the foundations of denial. In some camps, the Americans took a more systematic approach, pinning the photographs to bulletin boards placed in high-traffic areas, such as the paths to the mess halls. This forced every single prisoner, regardless of his rank or attitude, into a repeated, unavoidable confrontation with the evidence. Each furtive glance, each averted gaze, was a silent admission that the images could not be ignored. Whether the prisoners responded with muttered excuses, stony-faced silence, or visible disgust, the images were now burned into their collective memory. The ultimate power of these photographs lay not only in what they depicted, but in what they systematically destroyed. They stripped away the illusions sold by a decade of propaganda. They cracked the hard, protective shell of Nazi pride and superiority. They confronted ordinary soldiers, men who may never have personally fired a shot at a civilian or set foot inside a concentration camp, with the devastating knowledge that such places of horror existed, functioned, and were an integral part of the system they had sworn to defend, and that the world, now that it knew, would never, ever allow it to be forgotten. Thus, these simple pieces of photographic paper became weapons of immense power. Not weapons of steel and explosive, but weapons of truth, shattering the silence of complicity and ignorance, one horrific image at a time. Within the cramped and tense confines of the prisoner barracks, the conversations that erupted after the photographs were viewed were hushed, fractured, and charged with a palpable anxiety. Initially, the loudest and most strident voice was that of outright denial. A former Wehrmacht officer, seeking to maintain his eroding authority, might slam his hand on a wooden table and shout, "Lügen! Amerikanische Schauergeschichten!" Lies, American horror stories. His tone, carrying the residual weight of command, provided a psychological shield for many of the younger, more impressionable soldiers, who clung to his denials as a drowning man clings to flotsam. Yet, this armor of denial was not impervious. The photographs possessed a haunting persistence. They lingered in the mind's eye long after lights out, resurfacing in the dark stillness of the night. In hushed tones, men would whisper to their bunkmates, confessing that they had, in fact, heard disquieting rumors long before their capture. Rumors of mysterious trains disappearing into remote forests, rumors of government agencies requisitioning vast stockpiles of prisoner clothing without any logical explanation. When one soldier from Saxony quietly admitted that he had once caught a foul, inexplicable odor drifting from the vicinity of a camp near Weimar, he was quickly hushed by others, a testament to the enduring fear of speaking truths that had been dangerous even in the Third Reich's heyday. The emotional responses among the prisoners varied wildly. Some reacted with a defensive, wounded anger, their pride bruised not so much by the atrocities themselves, but by the shame of being confronted with them by their captors. Others fell into a deep, contemplative silence, staring for hours at the cracks in the floorboards, their minds replaying the horrific tableau of the photographs over and over. A few would mutter the weak, reflexive mantra, "It cannot be true because we would have known." But these words sounded increasingly hollow and pathetic with each repetition. American guards stationed at various camps began to notice a distinct shift in the atmosphere after the photographs were distributed. In a camp in France, the previously common sound of German marching songs echoing across the exercise yard gradually faded away. Instead, voices were lowered to a murmur. The prisoners' arguments shifted from debates about the timing of their eventual repatriation to anxious, fearful discussions about whether their own families back in Germany were aware of these atrocities or had even been complicit in some way. In another compound, tensions ran so high that a heated argument between two groups of prisoners, one still defending the Reich, the other beginning to accept the evidence, nearly escalated into a physical brawl, requiring American officers to intervene and separate them. The psychological dynamic at play was raw and profound. These men had been meticulously trained to see themselves as proud members of a righteous and honorable army. They had fought and watched their comrades die under banners that promised national glory and the protection of the fatherland. To be suddenly and violently confronted with the reality that their immense sacrifice was intrinsically linked to a policy of industrialized mass murder was a cognitive and moral blow that many could not absorb without fierce internal resistance. Some buried their confusion and guilt beneath a veneer of anger. Others numbed themselves with a strategic emotional withdrawal. But the seed of doubt had been irrevocably planted, and it began to spread its roots quietly through the population of the camp. The Americans took careful note of these changes. Guard reports from the period recorded that after the photographs were shown, the internal discipline and morale of the prisoner populations underwent a noticeable transformation. Some prisoners grew restless and sullen, displaying a new reluctance to participate in the formal morning roll call with their previous military bearing. One guard in a camp in Bavaria wrote in his log that a once defiant lieutenant, who had previously held his head high and issued sharp commands to his men, now shuffled through the compound with his eyes downcast, his spirit visibly broken. These subtle but significant behavioral shifts spoke volumes about the photograph's psychological impact. Even for those who clung most tenaciously to their disbelief, the images proved impossible to completely erase. Once introduced into the barracks, they became a permanent part of the prisoners' subconscious landscape, whispered about under blankets late at night, recalled in haunting detail during long, idle hours of captivity. They fueled suspicion, unease, and a gnawing, unspoken sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the glorious Reich they had served was founded upon an ocean of lies. The German prisoners were no longer wrestling solely with the sting of military defeat. They were now grappling with something far heavier, the burden of a terrible, emerging truth, carried into their midst not by bombs or bullets, but by fragile pieces of paper imprinted with unimaginable horror. The weight of this photographic evidence grew increasingly heavy as the calendar advanced through the pivotal months of April and May 1945. These were not abstract markings of time. They were milestones of horror, irrevocably carved into the timeline of history. The liberation of Buchenwald on April 11th, where American troops discovered over 20,000 survivors amidst scenes of unimaginable cruelty, was followed less than 3 weeks later by the forced opening of Dachau's gates on April 29th, revealing another 30,000 emaciated prisoners and train cars overflowing with the dead. Then, in early May, as the German state formally capitulated, the full, terrible reality of these places began to ripple outward across a shattered continent, its waves finally breaking against the guarded fences of the POW camps. For the German prisoners, these specific dates held a particular jarring significance. These were men whose lives had been governed by military timetables, precise offensive operations, and orders stamped with exact deadlines. Therefore, when the American Guards emphasized the exact calendar days on which the camps were liberated, the information struck with a unique force. These were not vague, unsubstantiated rumors whispered by a vengeful enemy. They were historical facts, tied to specific U.S. Army divisions, documented operations, and named commanding officers. The liberation of Dachau by the 45th Infantry Division on April 29th was a matter of official record. The arrival of the 6th Armored Division at Buchenwald was similarly documented. Even the most hardened skeptics among the prisoners found it increasingly difficult to dismiss evidence anchored to such concrete, verifiable historical events. Behind the barbed wire, each new chronological revelation deepened the prisoners' growing sense of unease and complicity. Some began to make uncomfortable mental connections, realizing that these dates of liberation overlapped with their own final days of military service. A soldier captured near Nuremberg might mutter that he had been engaged in a fierce firefight on the very same day that the gates of Dachau were being swung open. Another, who had been stationed in Thuringia months earlier, might reluctantly admit that he had once seen mysterious freight trains passing through his sector, a region that he now knew was frighteningly close to Buchenwald. These temporal and geographical connections became increasingly difficult to avoid, forcing a personal reckoning with the regime's crimes. The timeline of the war's final months also served another crucial purpose for the American captors. It exposed the breathtaking speed with which the entire Nazi narrative collapsed. As recently as March 1945, many German soldiers still clung to the faint hope that the Reich could negotiate a favorable peace. Yet, throughout April, Allied armies were not only overrunning German cities with stunning rapidity, but they were simultaneously tearing open the hidden, festering wounds of the concentration camp system, exposing the regime's darkest secrets to the light of day. Then, by May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, the war was irrevocably lost, and with it, the foundational lies of the Nazi state were laid bare for all to see. For the POWs, this rapid sequence of events was psychologically devastating. In the span of just a few weeks, their entire worldview, military, political, and moral, had utterly disintegrated. American Guards leveraged this chronological sequence with deliberate intent. They would unfold a photograph, cite its specific date of liberation, and state coldly, "This happened while you were still fighting, while you were still following orders." The strategy was simple, yet devastatingly effective. It forced the captive soldiers to confront the unbearable reality that these atrocities were not ancient history or enemy inventions, but were horrific events that had unfolded concurrently with their own final desperate battles, implicating them in a shared historical moment of profound shame. Some German prisoners reacted to this chronological confrontation with renewed hostility, accusing the Americans of weaponizing time itself. Yet many others grew withdrawn and somber. In diaries and memoirs recovered after the war, a number of former POWs admitted that those specific revelations in April and May 1945 marked the first irreversible cracks in their certainty. One prisoner wrote poignantly, "We lost the war in arms, but perhaps worse, we lost it in conscience when they showed us Dachau." By meticulously weaving the photographic evidence together with precise historical dates, the American authorities transformed a collection of random, shocking images into an undeniable, documented history. And in the heavy, contemplative silence that followed these revelations, the German POWs were left to face not only the fact of their military defeat, but the unbearable knowledge of what had been done in the name of their cause, exactly when and exactly where the Reich had still claimed to be fighting for its honor. From the American perspective, the act of showing these photographs was never an impulsive or cruel act of gloating over a defeated foe. It was a carefully considered policy, rooted in a complex mixture of strategic foresight and profound moral conviction. By the spring of 1945, the Allied High Command had come to a crucial understanding. The German soldier was not merely a military opponent to be disarmed and detained. He was also a potential carrier of a dangerous and resilient narrative. A narrative carefully constructed over 12 years of relentless Nazi propaganda, fortified by layers of willful denial and destined to evolve into a post-war myth of collective ignorance and victimhood. Breaking this narrative was seen as essential to securing a lasting peace, and sometimes the most potent weapon for this task was not a rifle, but a photograph. The GIs, who had personally walked into the infernos of Dachau, Buchenwald, and their countless subcamps, had been fundamentally transformed by the experience. The smell of death and decay that hung thick in the air, the sight of railway cars packed solid with emaciated corpses, the hollow, haunted eyes of the survivors. These sensory assaults seared themselves into the soldiers' memories, leaving psychological wounds that many admitted would never fully heal. Numerous American soldiers confessed in letters and interviews that they could scarcely eat or sleep for days after witnessing the camps. They felt a powerful, compulsive need to share this horrific burden, to force the very people they held responsible, the German soldiers and the society they represented, to confront the same awful reality. There was also a clear, long-term educational purpose behind the policy. American commanders, from junior officers up to the highest levels of command, actively encouraged their troops to disseminate the truth, not only among their own ranks to bolster morale and reinforce the rightness of their cause, but also among the defeated enemy. The hope was straightforward, yet ambitious. If German prisoners were confronted with irrefutable visual proof, perhaps they would carry these indelible memories back to their hometowns and villages upon their eventual release. The seeds of historical accountability and responsibility needed to be planted early, in the fertile ground of immediate post-war shock, before the weeds of denial could take root and harden into an impenetrable legend. In some instances, the American efforts were even more formalized. U.S. officers organized makeshift screening rooms within the camps, where captured German officers were compelled to watch motion picture footage shot by the liberators. These films showed the camps in horrifying motion. Emaciated survivors stumbling and collapsing as they tried to embrace their liberators, battle-hardened American soldiers turning away to vomit, overcome by the stench, bulldozers being used to push countless anonymous bodies into mass graves. The primary goal was not to humiliate the prisoners, but to force an unavoidable confrontation. To look away from the flickering images on the screen was to willfully deny a reality that the entire world was now witnessing. The policy also had a pragmatic, historical dimension. Allied planners were deeply concerned that without a massive body of hard, visual evidence, a defeated Germany, and perhaps even sectors of the Allied public might later dismiss the Holocaust as a gross exaggeration or a malicious fabrication. Indeed, whispers of disbelief were already circulating. By compelling tens of thousands of German soldiers to see the proof with their own eyes, or the eyes of their trusted comrades, the Americans were creating a vast, diffuse network of witnesses. These men, when they returned home, would become living conduits of the truth, making it exponentially more difficult for a culture of denial to establish itself in the decades to come. For the individual GI, the simple act of showing a photograph to a prisoner also served as a form of cathartic release. Many soldiers described being overwhelmed by a volatile mixture of rage, sorrow, and a desire for vengeance upon first entering the camps. Sharing the photographs with the POWs was a way of channeling these powerful, destructive emotions into a constructive, moral act. It was a way of saying, without screaming, look at what your regime, your ideology, your war has produced. This is the true face of the enemy we fought, and this is why our victory was an absolute moral necessity. While the policy was not universally applied, some guards considered it a futile exercise against men too deeply indoctrinated. Many participated in it informally, pulling creased photographs from their pockets and tossing them onto tables during routine searches or roll calls. Even in silence, the message was deafeningly clear. The Americans' ultimate intent was never merely to punish. It was to prevent the world from ever forgetting. They understood that wars eventually end, armistices are signed, and memories can fade or be deliberately distorted over time unless they are forcefully hammered into the collective conscience of a nation. By confronting German POWs with this stark, visual evidence in the critical spring and summer of 1945, the Allies were laying the essential groundwork for the future, for the Nuremberg trials, where these very photographs and film reels would carry as much weight as any spoken testimony, and for the long, painful process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, that would define post-war German society. The formidable walls of Nazi propaganda, which had once seemed unbreachable, began to show their first significant cracks within the confines of the POW compounds. For over a decade, German soldiers, like the rest of the population, had been subjected to a meticulously crafted alternate reality. They were told that concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald were nothing more than orderly, strict, but fundamentally fair institutions for the detention of criminals, communists, and other enemies of the state. Official Nazi films depicted these places as models of efficiency and hygiene, showing scenes of prisoners gardening, playing organized sports, and even forming orchestras. Newsreels praised the camp system as a necessary and productive tool for national discipline and social purification. A great many soldiers had accepted this sanitized version of reality without question, for to doubt it was to question the very moral foundation of the cause for which they were fighting and dying. But the photographs presented by the Americans presented a reality that was violently, irreconcilably different from the one sold to them by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. Instead of the well-fed, productive workers shown in the films, the photographs revealed living skeletons, their skin stretched like parchment over bone, their eyes vacant with the suffering that transcended mere hunger. Instead of the clean, orderly dormitories, the images showed overcrowded wooden bunks stacked with the dead and the dying. Instead of the proud labor brigades marching to work, the cameras had captured hollow-eyed survivors who could barely stand, clinging to one another for the most basic physical support. The neat, reassuring illusions manufactured by the propaganda ministry disintegrated instantaneously when placed next to these raw, uncensored images from the camps themselves. In the initial stages, some POWs clung to the discredited myths with desperate tenacity. The Americans staged this, they would argue. They gathered these people from bombed-out cities and starved them just to take these pictures. Others, reaching for any possible explanation, insisted that the dead must have been victims of Allied bombing raids that had disrupted food supplies, not the result of a deliberate policy of extermination. But their protests began to sound increasingly feeble and contrived. The American guards, armed with specific names, precise geographical locations, and exact dates, countered their objections with cold, hard facts. Dachau, liberated on April 29th. Buchenwald on April 11th. Bergen-Belsen, freed by the British on April 15th. Each verifiable fact struck like a hammer against the fragile edifice of their excuses, and gradually the cracks in their belief system widened. A soldier who had once proudly boasted about the Reich's economic and social achievements might now sit in a corner, staring into the middle distance, utterly silenced by the mental image of corpses stacked higher than a man. An officer who had once lectured his men on the importance of discipline and faith in the Führer might now actively avoid making eye contact when the American guards pinned the latest set of photographs to the camp's bulletin board. Their pride, which had served as their psychological armor for so long, was being pierced clean through by the relentless, unforgiving weight of the evidence. What made this process of ideological unraveling so profoundly painful was the dawning realization that the propaganda had not merely fooled the outside world, it had fooled them. To finally accept the truth of the photographs meant admitting that they had fought, bled, watched their friends die, and sacrificed their youth in the service of a regime that was built upon a foundation of monstrous lies and genocidal policies. This realization, when it came, cut deeper than any battlefield wound, for it struck at the meaning of their entire adult lives. One POW later confided in his journal, "It was infinitely easier to believe that the Allies were lying than to accept that we ourselves had been lied to all along." And even for those who remained outwardly defiant, who never voiced a word of acceptance, the process of unseeing the photographs proved impossible. The images had taken up residence in their minds, creating a permanent internal contradiction to every poster, every newsreel, every radio broadcast they had ever trusted. The slow, uneven, and fiercely resisted unraveling of the Nazi myth was, nevertheless, unstoppable. Once the curtain had been pulled back to reveal the horrifying truth behind the stagecraft, it could never be drawn shut again. For the Americans observing this transformation, the collapse of these deeply held illusions represented a victory of a different, perhaps more enduring kind. The war on the battlefield was already won. But here, within the guarded confines of the POW camps, another equally vital war was being waged. The war for historical truth. And in that war, the sophisticated machinery of Nazi propaganda proved utterly powerless against the simple, devastating weight of evidence carried in a soldier's pocket. Daily life inside the POW camps underwent a perceptible and significant transformation in the wake of the photograph's circulation. Compounds that had once been filled with the sounds of German marching songs, shouted drills, and the proud, defiant banter of men who still believed in their ultimate vindication, slowly grew more subdued and introspective. American guards reported that prisoners who had previously strutted through the grounds with an air of unbroken confidence now moved with a slower, more shuffling gait, their eyes frequently lowered to the ground. The weight pressing upon them was not merely the burden of defeat, it was the heavy, psychological burden of the images they could not erase from their memories. The nature of conversations during meal times evolved markedly. Soldiers who had once passionately debated military strategy or boasted about the miracle weapons that Berlin had promised would turn the tide of war, now engaged in hushed, anxious whispers. They speculated about whether their families back in Germany had any knowledge of these camps. Some began to write letters home with a new and uncharacteristic caution, carefully avoiding any talk of national honor or final victory, and replacing such phrases with vague, hopeful expressions about simply returning home alive one day. Others, overwhelmed by a sense of shame and complicity, chose to cease writing altogether, severing this fragile link to their past lives. American officers monitoring the camps observed that the photograph's impact rippled through the prisoners' internal discipline and social structures. In certain camps, German prisoners became increasingly reluctant to volunteer for the internal leadership roles that helped maintain order within the compounds, leaving a vacuum in the once rigidly maintained hierarchy. Where there had previously been crisp automatic salutes to captured officers, there was now a palpable hesitation, a weakening of the bonds of military deference. Some prisoners even began to feign illness to avoid participating in the daily roll calls, though the guards often suspected that the real malady was not physical, but a profound loss of will, belief, and sense of purpose. There were also moments of raw, open confrontation among the prisoners themselves. In one camp in France, two distinct factions nearly came to blows. One group, still clinging desperately to the notion that the photographs were elaborate fakes, confronted another group that had begun to accept the evidence as undeniable. The American guards were forced to intervene to prevent violence, But the deep fracture within the prisoner community was now starkly visible. The unifying power of the Reich's myths, which had once bound these men together as comrades, had given way to suspicion, accusation, and internal division. Even in the letters that were smuggled out of the camps, or that passed through censorship, subtle traces of this profound shift began to appear. Some POWs hinted cryptically to their families that they had been shown terrible pictures by the Americans, though military censorship prevented them from going into detail. Others admitted in carefully coded phrases that things were not as we were told. These were not full confessions of personal guilt, but they were unmistakable cracks in the once solid wall of collective denial. And these cracks were of immense historical importance, because when these prisoners were eventually released and returned to German society in the years that followed, they carried these troubled memories back with them, directly into the heart of a nation that would soon be embroiled in decades of painful debate about collective responsibility and knowledge. For many of the prisoners, a guarded silence became the safest and most common response. It was better to say nothing at all than to risk admitting too much, either to their captors or to themselves. Guards frequently described mess halls where the only sounds were the metallic clatter of tin plates and spoons, a striking and telling contrast to the defiant choruses of Lily Marlene or Erica that had once echoed from the same rooms. This change was not merely psychological, it was cultural. It represented the collapse of a shared identity and a collective pride that had, for years, defined these men and given meaning to their sacrifices. In this sense, the Americans had achieved something of profound and lasting significance. They had forced the prisoners to look into a mirror reflecting not their own faces, but the horrifying consequences of the ideology they had served. Not every prisoner admitted what he saw in that reflection, but none could walk away from it entirely untouched. The aftermath of the photographs was not an immediate mass confession of guilt, but rather a slow, relentless process of erosion. Pride gradually turned to unease. Unease morphed into a heavy, contemplative silence, and that silence, in turn, became the vessel for the unbearable burden of knowledge. And within that collective silence, the course of history was subtly but permanently shifted, for the images had planted seeds of truth that no amount of subsequent propaganda, denial, or passage of time could ever fully eradicate.